Right there, yeah. There we go. We were talking during lunch about some of the initiatives that are going on with CHAMP. That's into your center, right, CHAMP? Do I have it right? Chart, that's what it was, I'm sorry. And CHAMP is a Kentucky initiative. And we started talking about risk map programs and how possibly there seemed to be some parallels in the work that we were doing. And is everybody here familiar with risk map, Nhma's risk map program? Can I see a show of hands? Everybody is? Okay, so everyone knows that it's an acronym for Risk Mapping, Assessment, and Planning. We started talking about the technical assistance that will be provided on the assessment and planning sides. The funding comes from the National Flood Insurance Program, so the mapping portion is then, again, updating the National Flood Insurance maps. And then the assessment and planning is, assessment would be possibly hazardous risk assessment, and then we'll also be providing planning technical assistance. And through the planning technical assistance is where we're starting to look at maybe supporting communities that would share the characteristics with project impact communities and starting to bring in some of those principles. We also talked about a success story that came out of Florida's post-disaster redevelopment planning initiative. Some of you may be familiar with Gene Henry and his planning work down there. Hillsborough County developed a post-disaster redevelopment plan. And one of the concepts that came out of that was priority recovery areas, which in a way is a misnomer. It really affected some of the people. Maybe we're not landing on a name yet, but more or less a community resiliency center, which is not necessarily a structure, although it could be a structure, and Margaret Davidson was kind of leaning in that direction in our discussions this afternoon. But really an area. And actually there's a map online where you can see that these community resiliency centers, there are several factors that came into selecting those areas, such as the economic development plan for the community, the comprehensive plan, also known as general plans in some areas for the community, the local mitigation plan, the local emergency operations plan, and any other regional planning mechanisms overlaid all to look for those areas that were not necessarily safe but less hazardous. So this concept of community resiliency centers, we started to look at how could we make them allow them to share the characteristics of project impact communities. FEMA currently touches 400 communities a year through Risk Map, and that's approximately a 5-year cycle. So the first year, approximately 400 communities would be touched, and the next year another 400, and this is across the nation on a watershed basis. So we were just trying to look at how we could possibly integrate those two projects, or maybe not necessarily hang our hat this time just on FEMA, but look for a diverse portfolio of funding sources, so that if perhaps the funding in one area is decreased or reduced, then we would be able to continue on creating disaster-resilient communities through that. Is that kind of what you're looking for?
Yeah.
Okay.
Great summary.
So we believe the general consensus in the room was that idea provides probably the best single vehicle for us to move forward on promoting disaster-resilient communities. There was additional discussion about gaps. One regards research and knowledge on what's happening out there. How are communities doing disaster resilience? What organizations are involved with that? There is no one single source of information for that, although there's a number of groups working on that. I mentioned in the session that the Stevenson Institute says that in conjunction with Nhma and IAEM that they've been gathering best practice information. I know the Natural Hazards Center has information that they have gathered, and I'm sure there are other academic institutions that are doing the same. So one of the things that we identified in our discussions was the need to have some kind of catalog of best practices, some kind of catalog of what's going on out there, so that we can get some idea about who to work with, who to model after, who to talk to. And so that was identified as one of the gaps that perhaps we should work on. In the final section, Bill Hook came back, and he was basically to lead us in a wrap-up and to try to come up with a preliminary framework for action. the ideas that we came up with that we thought should be forwarded to the board with possible implementation by the Disaster Resilient Communities Committee are as follows. One, the partnership with FEMA, talking with them about how we could perhaps move forward on promoting disaster resiliency centers in conjunction with RISMAC, how NHMA could be perhaps involved with that. Two, working with academic partners like the Natural Hazard Center and others on them gathering the information and cataloging information. I don't think there was a sense that NHMA should be the one doing it, but doing it in collaboration with other entities that actually do research well. There was a third related project. It actually ties in with the first two I mentioned, and that is increasing our number of partnerships and actually creating a network of multi-interest entities that would work on building disaster resilient communities. And by multiple interests, we're talking about sustainability, we're talking about mitigation, finding some of those, at first blush, partners you wouldn't think of, and for NHMA to partner with them and try to create some kind of alliance to do that. I know we have a Natural Hazard Mitigation Alliance. I'm hoping that what we were discussing here might be a little broader than that. But this is something actually that the NHMA board needs to discuss. Where do we put our emphasis? Where do we put our areas of focus when all we have is a volunteer executive director, a volunteer board, and a lot of passion? So that is what we did today. And I do want to make one final thought, one final push with you all. The Disaster Resilient Communities Committee actually started out with a large number of people that were meeting monthly. I can tell you right now we are down to a handful that show up on the monthly conference calls. Frankly, we need assistance. If we want to have a program for disaster resilient communities in conjunction with NHMA, I need some people in this room and others to consider joining the committee. I would love to have your assistance and would ask you to talk to me later about it. Thank you.
Is it fair to ask a question?
Absolutely. I was just going to open it up for questions now, and I think you're probably mostly going to ask questions of each other and Darren and Tim. So I will sit down and just open it up to everybody.
And Alessandra, if you don't mind, if we could pass the mic around as people have
Come on up.
questions.
I'll walk around with the mic.
Yeah,
I've never had anybody couldn't hear my voice.
And if,
I don't tend to have that problem either.
if everybody could give your name first so we can catch it on the tape here.
Harold Snodgrass. Lou Dooley, Pierce County Emergency Management. I'm a bit confused, and it may be, again, my lack of experience with the group, but I was a little bit, I don't know, confused or put off on Tuesday, I guess it was, when the group at large had a hard time agreeing with what resilience was. And then to hear a report from you about all the things that we desire to do or great things that we're already doing, I guess that leaves a question in my mind of some resolution around what resilience is. We have a mantra in our office that's up on the wall about building a disaster resilient Pierce County. And I'm uncomfortable with that without us really having that a sure grasp of that.
Anybody that knows me knows that I am technically challenged, so apologies. I agree with you. I was frankly, the one problem I had this year with the natural hazards workshop, and it had nothing to do with the quality of the speakers or the presentations, was that the basic sense you got after listening to everybody talk was we agree to disagree about what resilience means. And in fact, we had originally talked about calling this disaster-resistant communities because of the relationship to project impact, which had a definition for that in terms of particularly mitigation, but also preparedness and planning. I guess for me, and there seemed to be, and please, anybody that was involved in the track, please speak up and add your input. Our focus when we were talking about resilience was really on minimizing the impact of disaster. That became the focus, and that was really where we came down on it. And it does include other components. Most certainly when you're talking about environmental sustainability, that's included as a component, but you've got to look at the end goal. And I think Susan Cutter said it best. After a long discussion about resilience, she said, sometimes we forget the end goal is to minimize loss. And so I think that is where we were leading our discussion. Would anybody in that track disagree with me?
You've got a comment back here.
I just want to make a couple comments on definitions. One is a philosopher named Michael Pontier, who was actually a chemist, said we know more than we can say. And I think we need to remember that when we try to define things. The other thing is definitions are essentially metaphors. And what metaphors do, I believe, is not describe reality, but give us ways into the future. So the way we define resilience, and I think we ought to have a number of definitions, are ways that could lead us into alternative futures. And I think that's the value of having a number of metaphors or definitions rather than one. So metaphors open the future or they close the future. And our talk about resilience, I hope, will open the future.